I met Linda over 12 years ago. She's a Princeton-educated attorney, and she's been in the field of benefit management, drug contracting for over 20 years. She has litigated against PBMs for a significant amount of time and can talk more about that experience. But what's really interesting about Linda is she comes from a family that's been involved in policy from before she was born, in that her father was a chief of staff to Hubert Humphrey and was involved in the creation of the Food and Drug Administration that knows it and regulates prescriptions. So Linda's family interest and her background has brought an exposure to policy and practice and industry that few have. And so you may not necessarily know that or see that in her resume, but she does have that interesting background. If you don't know that, if you didn't get to read the New York Times this morning, it quoted that 72,000 Americans died last year from the overdose to illegal drugs. 72,000. That's more deaths than HIV, gun accidents, or auto accidents combined. Those are illegal drugs, right? And the illegal drug industry is worth $100 billion a year. The medical industry is worth $4 trillion a year. Let Linda talk about how much just the legal drug industry is. So as we look at that impact of illegal drugs in America, we've become so blinded to the effect of those transactions, because to transport the drugs to here, they have the transaction, and then money has got to be laundered and thrown out of the country. It is a huge impact that we, as 2 and 3 generations of dealing with cartels, we don't even understand the impact that's happening to us today. Well, what Linda's job in the next 40 minutes is to talk about some of the potential legal cartels that's happening and introduce you to the transactions of the drug industry and how, as buyers, we don't necessarily know the price that we're buying, and how sellers are legally allowed to not to disclose. And so with that information, I appreciate Linda.
That was a great introduction. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by telling you, I have a bunch of clients, and this is the honest to God's truth. I have a bunch of clients. I've been doing this consulting work since 2005. Paul Mackey was one of my first clients. I think we met in 2006. He did an RFP, and the entity that won the RFP was Envision. And I've been working with him on and off since, and been working with him extensively in the past several years. And he is one of my favorite clients. And he's one of my favorite clients because he cares about what he's doing, and he spends an immense amount of time trying to make sure he's doing it right. And he hits a remarkable balance between saving his company very large sums of money by doing this and making sure his plan beneficiaries, his minors, get much better medical treatment. And that balance is a very hard balance to hit. What most people are doing is entirely ignoring the issue. And when they ignore the issue, what they end up with is far higher costs and far worse medical treatment, because nobody's paying any attention and the drugs are just pouring out and people are just taking the drugs, and the drugs are literally killing people. And the second half of this this morning's session, you're going to hear about polypharmacy, and you're going to hear about how if you over-medicate yourself, you're actually in much worse danger than if you just don't take the darn drugs in the first place. So what Paul has done at Alliance Coal is really, I always tell other people, if you want to do something, if you want to hear about how to be cutting edge, call up Paul Mackey, and he will tell you what he's doing, and then you can try to replicate it. If you just start thinking it through and really working at it, you really can change the medical treatment of your plan beneficiaries, and you really can save money. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to focus today on the rebate problem and a few other problems with prescription drug coverage. And I've picked rebates to focus on in particular because if you read the newspaper, you probably are reading a lot about rebates. So that's why I'm focused on it. It's not the only problem. It's not necessarily the biggest problem. It's one of many, many problems. But it is a very big problem, and it's completely placing drug coverage off kilter, and I'm going to explain why. And then I'm going to cover a couple of other problems. I'll try to whiz through this reasonably quickly. If you have questions, if you could hold them to the end, that would be great. So as an overview, I'm going to talk about PBM's rebate games. I call them games. I put it in quotes. They're very pernicious, so it's kind of a misnomer. But I'm going to talk about PBM's rebate games and how they increase your drug coverage costs. Then I'm going to talk about other problems and how they increase your costs. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what you can do to change the situation. So, part one, PBM's rebate games. The newspapers and TV channels are filled with stories about rebate problems. So this is an article from the New York Times from relatively recently. You can read the headlines: Meet the Rebate, the new villain of high drug prices. Major article in the New York Times. This is Scott Gottlieb. You probably recognize him. He's a new FDA commissioner, extremely active, very knowledgeable, trying to do something about changing the way the FDA handles matters. And if you see the headline, it says FDA takes aim at drug pricing rebates. It's not even in his bailiwick, but he knows rebates are a problem. He can't really do anything about them. The FDA doesn't handle rebates. But here we got an article about how he's going to try to do something about them. HHS Secretary, Health and Human Services Secretary Azar calls for a system without rebates. Azar is the former CEO of Lilly. He understands rebates better than almost anybody could. He knows all about them. Lilly's been paying them for decades. He gets what they're doing to the system. He's at CMS now. He's talking about eliminating them. Pfizer CEO Ian Reid reckons rebates will disappear, and that's a positive. Pfizer's obviously a drug manufacturer. I'm going to talk about why he wants rebates to disappear. The manufacturers will benefit from it. Again, another newspaper story. So you can see rebates, 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 rebates. They're in the headlines. And then finally, you may have heard about Carl Icahn taking on the Express Scripts merger. If you read this article, you'll see one of his major reasons for doing so is rebates. He says Express Scripts is going to be in trouble because it's making fortune off of rebates. He thinks the rebates are going to be eliminated. If they get eliminated, he thinks Express Scripts is going to tank. So he's against the merger because he doesn't want the two companies to merge and then for them both to go under. So all about rebates, all newspaper headlines from relatively recently. So now we're going to get down into the meat of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to walk you through the rebate problem using one therapeutic category, hepatitis C drugs. I've given you all a handout, and it may be that you can see this a little better in your handout if you flip to the page. But if you can see it, I'm going to reference rows if I can, to help you if I can help you walk through it by referencing the rows. So as you know, hepatitis C drugs, there was a breakthrough. There used to be drugs that were hepatitis C treatments. They didn't treat all forms of hep C. And the drugs that were on the market had very bad side effects, so many people started on them and couldn't stay on them long enough to have a chance at getting cured. And if they did stay on them long enough, in many instances, they weren't cured anyway. So the drugs were, I would say, quite weak, ineffective, and the side effects of them were so strong that they were really problematic. And then there was a breakthrough in 2013 with a drug called Sovaldi. It was the first of the big breakthrough drugs, and it was remarkable because its side effects were very de minimis, and its cure rates were extraordinary. People could get on it 12 weeks later with very limited side effects, be cured at about a 95% or better rate. So since then, there have been a lot of other hep C drugs that also have both of those remarkable results. Very limited side effects, therefore people can stay on them for quite a while and for the necessary time, and in almost all instances they end up with cures. So I've listed here for you these new hep C drugs. The one other thing you need to know about hep C drugs is when Sovaldi came on, it was one of the first drugs that came on that had an immense price tag, and it caused quite a stir. The price tag at the time, and depending upon what newspaper you were looking at it, it was generally referenced as $86,000 per person per treatment. And one of the big problems with it is there's a lot of people with Hep C. So this wasn't a treatment that was extremely expensive that only a few people were going to be taking. It was a treatment that was available and necessary to be used to treat millions and millions of people at $86,000 a treatment. So now we have a lot of drugs, and the question is, which ones are going to be taken? And if you look across this table, what we've assembled is I've got just in the far left side the row number in order to try to walk you through this better. Then I've got the name of the product. Then I've got the manufacturer of the drug. You'll see that many of these drugs are made by Gilead, who was the original maker of Sovaldi. And then another major manufacturer is Abvi. Then I've got a column called genotype, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. Then the daily dosage rate, then the unit AWP. Unit AWP is the per pill price. And then the 4-week AWP cost, so adding up all the pills for 4 weeks, what would it cost? And then the 8-week per pill cost altogether, aggrandized. The 12-week, there's an expected 60% discount on one of the drugs that was just announced. And then finally, does the drug need to be combined with ribavirin? So going back over this now, with having given you that overview, let me tell you why we have all these columns. Let me start by pointing out that on the 8-week AWP cost, there's only one drug. It's Maviret down in row 10. And you'll see that for Maviret, the 8-week treatment cost is $31,680. The reason there's no other treatments that are listed with an 8-week cost is all of the other drug treatments, you need to take it for 12 weeks. So Maviret right out of the box has an advantage. It's only an 8-week, you can take it for 8 weeks and essentially get that cure. It's a very recently approved drug. Looking down the 12-week AWP cost column, you can see that we sorted these drugs by highest to lowest cost treatment. So it starts with Harvoni's got the highest 12-week treatment cost. That's $113,400 going straight down. So these are the AWP costs. We're not factoring in the discount that the pharmacy benefit management company might give. We're not factoring in coupons. We're just looking at the AWP cost because it's a way to compare what the list prices of the drugs are. So, and then you see at the very bottom, Zapatir, which would have been for a 12-week treatment $65,000, is now, because of a 60% discount, down to $26,000. So if you looked at this and you said nothing else, and you had a choice between treatments, and you were the plan, or you were the pharmacy benefit management company, the PBM, you might say, well, we're just going to run with the Zapatir because it's the cheapest, right? But there's other things you need to factor in. So those other things we try to capture in this chart. First of all, Vosevi on line 7, was approved as a second-line treatment. So I'm going to eliminate it because you don't take it until you've tried something else and failed. So let's forget about Vosevi. Looking at the genotype column, there are 6 different basic genotypes of Hep C. About 75% of Americans have genotype 1. So if you're a pharmacy benefit management company, you're trying to decide which of these drugs to cover, you're going to know you want to make sure to cover genotype 1, okay? About 25% of people have genotype 2 or 3. So a pharmacy benefit management company or an insurance company that's trying to decide which drugs to cover is going to want to definitely cover drugs that cover genotypes 1, 2, and 3. So if you look down this chart, you'll see that the only drugs here that cover those 3, genotypes 1, 2, and 3, are Clusa, line 6, line 7, Vosevi, which we're basically going to put aside because it's a second-line treatment, and then Maviret, right? There's only 3. So a pharmacy benefit management company that's trying to make sure that everybody will have coverage, almost everybody will have coverage, then wants to make sure genotypes 1, 2, and 3 are covered, are automatically going to be steered, that pharmacy benefit management company is automatically going to be steered to a Clusa or Maviret. Otherwise, they're going to leave off, if they picked one of those other drugs and didn't cover anything else, they'd be leaving off 25% of the population, right? So, so now we've got Epclusa versus Movirit, and we already know Movirit is an 8-week possible treatment cost. So Movirit's got two things going in its favor right now. Epclusa has a total treatment cost of $89,000. And Movirit has a total treatment cost of $31,000. And you'll notice that the least expensive drug, the final line item, is a Potier that Merck makes, which is also a new drug that's been heavily discounted at $26,000, doesn't cover genotypes 2 and 3. So if you're a plan and your PBM puts out a program and says, these are the Hep C drugs we're covering, you'd want to know that the PBM was focused on cost, of course, and also focused on making sure that all your members had treatment. So looking at this chart, if your PBM came out and said, we're going to include Epclusa and we're going to exclude Movirit, you might scratch your head and say, well, wait a second, Epclusa is a lot more expensive than Movirit. They both cover genotypes 1, 2, and 3. Why would you be covering Epclusa and including it on your formulary and not including Movirit? You'd have to ask that question if you had enough information, right? And the only answer that they might be able to give you is, we're getting rebates. So then the next question in theory you'd want to ask is, how much are you getting in rebates and how much are you going to pass through to me? Because I would like to know that the rebates on Epclusa that I'm going to be getting, that you're going to be passing through to me, are going to bring me down to the cost of Movirit. Otherwise, there would be no reason for you to include Epclusa and exclude Movirit. So now you see why rebates are suddenly important, right? There's one other aspect of Hep C drugs that you would want to focus on therapeutically, that you want to make sure that your PBM was focusing on, and that is the final column. Does the drug often or sometimes or never need to be accompanied by another drug called ribavirin? And the reason you'd want to know that is because ribavirin can have some side effects that affect people, may make people non-compliant, and therefore, if it's possible to take the main drug without ribavirin, you'd be better off. And because doctors know that, doctors prefer to prescribe drugs that don't have to necessarily have ribavirin accompanying them. So again, looking at this column, there's only one drug that's ribavirin-free, and it's Movirit. So now I've got another reason why, in theory, my PBM might be wanting to favor Movirit. I've got 3 reasons. It's an 8-week treatment, it appears to be the less expensive, and it's ribavirin-free. Okay, so the big question of the day in terms of cost here is rebates, right? So every PBM executes contracts with manufacturers to decide the drugs that they're going to include, or they're going to and favor on their formulary, or they're going to exclude. So PBMs contracts with manufacturers. They agree to get rebates. The manufacturers say, the PBM goes to the manufacturer and says, how much will you pay me in rebates? And they go to the next manufacturer. They go to Gilead, then they go to AbbVie, then they go to Merck. They ask each of them, how much will you pay me in rebates? And each of them gives them an offer, and then they see what those offers are. And in theory, they compare them to the price of the drug. And in theory, they try to get to the lowest net cost drug, in theory. There's a problem, though, because PBMs, when they're negotiating contracts with manufacturers and trying to get rebates, are also arranging to get paid manufacturer administrative fees. They're also arranging to get paid price protection rebates, which are a different form of rebates, which they may call something else, like inflation protection discounts. They're also, in many instances, getting health management fees and data sales fees and prompt payment discounts and purchase money discounts. And you invent the label, and I can assure you they've invented it too. There's lots and lots of these labels. I know that because in litigation, we got boxes and boxes of rebate documents from very large PBMs, and we saw what they were being called. And I'm telling you, you invent the label, they've thought of it. So they're collecting all of this money. I capture that with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're collecting all of this money from manufacturers. Typically, the only money that they pass through to clients is the rebate money. All the other money they keep for themselves. Okay? So they're collecting all this money. They're choosing how to label it because a 5% rebate technically is no different from a 5% discount or a 5% manufacturer administrative fee or 5% anything else they want to label it. It's all 5% of the total dollar volume that's sold. So what makes them call it a rebate versus what makes them call it something else? The manufacturer doesn't care. To the manufacturer, 5% is 5% of the total cost of drugs sold. The PBM cares because they know that the contracts with their clients, meaning with you, require them to pass through rebates to you. But they also know that their contracts with you do not require them to pass through anything else. So if they label it something other than a rebate, they will get to keep it. So obviously this creates a massive conflict of interest on the part of PBMs because they're sitting in the center of this entire arrangement. They're negotiating, trying to figure out which drugs to include on the formulary. They have a choice of drugs. The drugs have different prices. They're going to collect rebates to discount some of those prices. And depending upon what they collect in those rebates, they'll get to lowest net cost or they won't. When they're dividing up all the money that the manufacturers are going to pay them, they can put more or less money in the rebate subset and put more or less money in all of these other categories. And there's a particular problem with all of this, which is if you go and ask any PBM in the country, tell me how much you're collecting in rebates and tell me how much you're collecting in other monies, the answer will be that's proprietary information. There's another problem, which is if you say to them, tell me how much you're collecting on this hepatitis drug, they will say, we won't tell you, it's proprietary information. So summing that problem up, if you ask yourself, what does every plan need to know? So you've got all these hep C drugs, and you're trying to figure out, is your PBM acting in your interest by choosing which drugs, the drugs that it's chosen to include on the formulary? Has it acted in your interest, or has it acted contrary to your interests? If you know what I told you about two pools of money, you've got to be a little bit worried that maybe they're acting contrary to your interests, because they have their own interest, which is collecting as much money as they can. So what would you need to know? Every plan, including yours, would need to know the drug-by-drug rebates that will be passed through to you. Drug-by-drug, meaning on every one of those hep C drugs, you want to know, drug-by-drug, how much you'll get in rebates. Then you'll know the net cost of each, and then you'll be able to determine whether or not the PBM has decided to exclude the right drugs and include the right drugs. So you'd want to know the drug-by-drug rebates to know net cost. Ideally, you'd also like to know the other payments that the PBM is getting. And why would you want to know that? For two reasons. One, it would enable you to determine how much you might be losing in savings and why your PBM may be favoring what I'll call the wrong drug. And then secondly, that information would tell you how much you might otherwise be able to save, because if they would only pass that money through to you, you'd get more in savings, right? So that's the information you want to know. In summing up what they're willing to tell you, they're willing to tell you none of that. So they will not disclose the total amounts they collect. They will not disclose the total rebates they collect. They will not disclose the total other payments they collect. They will not disclose drug-by-drug rebate information on any specific drug, which means you can't know the net costs of drugs. You're left just trusting them. And they will not disclose with respect to the other payments, either the drug-by-drug or the total amounts. So you don't have any idea how much extra money they've made on each of these drugs that might be incentivizing them to favor a different drug. So now let's go to a real-life example. Express Scripts just recently, it's one of the largest PBMs in the country, just recently announced what their new formulary exclusions were going to be for 2019. And among the things that they bragged about was what they're doing with hep C drugs. So I've charted for you the drugs they've decided to exclude. They're on the left side, Sovaldi, Alisio, Declinza, and Maviret. And I've charted for you the drugs that they've said they're now going to be including. Those are Harvoni, Vosevi, Epclusa, Zapatir. It's not quite clear what they're doing with Vicaripac because they didn't say what they were going to do with the drugs that used to be on the formulary. Vicaripac wasn't listed as an excluded drug, but it used to be on their formulary, so it may be they're still including it. It's just not clear from their announcement what they're doing. So if Express Scripts is unwilling to provide drug-by-drug rebate information, every Express Scripts client is left just wondering, knowing what we've just discussed, left wondering, is Express Scripts actually acting in my plan's interests? So I want to walk with you through the chart one more time just to exemplify that and make sure it's really clear why that's the case. So here's our same chart, and I've marked in lines going across the chart the drugs that Express Scripts is including. You'll see one of the included drugs is Harvoni. It's the most expensive drug, okay? And it doesn't treat genotypes 2 and 3. So genotype 1, it does treat. Then they're including Epclusa. That does treat 1 through 6, so that's good, but it has a cost of $89,000. They are not including Maviret, which is the other alternative that treated 1 through 6, genotypes 1 through 6, which is very low cost and which is ribavirin-free. And they are including Zapatir, but Zapatir doesn't treat all the genotypes. It is the lowest cost, and sometimes it has to be used with ribavirin. So if you study this chart and you think about it, anybody who has genotypes 2 and 3, that's about 25% of the population, automatically is going to end up using Epclusa, right? Because they can't use Zapatir. So 25% of your population is now using Epclusa rather than what could have been an alternative, Maviret. And every Express Scripts client who understands all of this would have to scratch their heads and say to themselves, well, wait a second, I'm not sure what's going on here. How much are you getting in rebates that you chose to include Epclusa rather than chose to include Maviret, right? Because I'll tell you what the mathematical calculation is. If they're not getting 64% of the total drug cost back in rebates and passing it all through, so it has to be a 64% rebate on Epclusa, then the drug will be higher cost than Maviret would have been. That's the differential in the price. And in terms of Harvoni, if someone were to take Harvoni rather than Maviret, the differential in price is an 80% rebate they would have to be getting. So anybody who's with Express Scripts should be asking Express Scripts, how much are you passing through to me on these Hep C drugs, drug by drug? Because we would like to know why Maviret got excluded. So what this highlights is the critical importance of rebates and why every plan ought to have access to drug-by-drug rebate information. So rebate problem number 1, for sure, is a plan can't determine whether a PBM's decisions to exclude certain drugs and include other drugs in each therapeutic category on the PBM's formulary are whether those decisions are in the plan's interests. If they don't have drug-by-drug rebate information, if your plan doesn't have that information, you're cooked. You're just left trusting your PBM. And I just gave you a very good example with among the highest cost drugs that you're paying for, why you really need that information.
So if you ask that question and they say it's proprietary and don't answer you.
I'm going to get to what you can do about it.
Okay, thank you.
So there's other rebate problems as well. You can see the critical importance of them. Rebate problem number 2, the more rebates and other payments that the PBMs are extracting, the more manufacturers are raising their list prices. So this is what's been in the newspaper. It's a two-step dance, our firm calls it. So PBM goes to the manufacturer, how much will you pay? Extracts as much money as possible. Manufacturer agrees to pay the money to try to get on the formulary. Some of the money is rebates, some of the money is all those other payments. And then what does the manufacturer do? Raises his price, like any company would. He's got an expense, he's got to cover his expense. So the PBM secret contracts, therefore, that they're entering into with the manufacturers are essentially driving up prices, which is why you saw all of those headlines that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. Making matters worse, when the manufacturers increase their list prices to respond to PBM's extraction of payments, the manufacturers are presumably doing so based on all of the payments they're paying out, right? They're not just doing so based on the rebates they're paying out a big amount of money, rebates and all these other payments. So they're going to have to make up for all of the money they're paying out. But most plans aren't getting any benefit from anything other than the rebates. So the manufacturer's prices are going up based on all of the payments that are being paid out, but the discounts, so to speak, that the plans are experiencing from the rebates are not necessarily going down in the same proportion. Making matters even worse, the plan beneficiaries aren't getting any benefits from the rebates or the other payments. So as the list prices go up, to the extent your beneficiaries are paying a co-insurance payment and the list prices are going up, they're paying on higher and higher prices based on higher and higher amounts of money being paid out for rebates and other payments, and they're not getting the benefit of any of that because plans keep the rebates. So this two-step dance of PBMs extracting money, keeping some of it for themselves, certainly is driving up prices. And not only is it driving up prices, but it's driving up prices more than the benefits that are resulting both to the plans and to the plan beneficiaries. Rebate problem number 4, PBMs that are favoring the highest cost drugs can collect and promise the most in rebates. That's just logical. If a drug costs $100,000, if Gilead has Harvoni at $100,000 and Merck has Zapatir at $26,000, who's going to be able to pay out more in rebates and still make a profit? So there's an incentive for manufacturers to put their drugs on at very high prices and then bid them down through this extraction process that PBMs are going through. But it also means on the other end, to the extent that the PBMs are trying to extract more and more money and put some of it in their own pockets, they're much more likely to favor the higher cost drugs because the higher cost drugs are the ones that the manufacturers can pay more money out on. So if that's the case, and if PBMs can promise more in total rebates by favoring higher cost drugs, we have a real problem. Because if consulting firms and plans are basically spreadsheeting numbers and saying, how much will you pay me in a rebate? And the PBMs that favor the highest cost drugs can pay out the most in rebates, and you're going to pick the PBMs that pay the most in rebates, you're going to be picking the very PBMs that are favoring the highest cost drugs. So you do not want your consulting firm looking at a spreadsheet and saying, this PBM is paying out the most in rebates, therefore I'm going to choose this PBM. Because if that PBM is paying out the most in rebates, there's a very good chance that's the PBM that's favoring Harvoni instead of Movirit. They're positioning themselves to pay out more in rebates. And no matter how much they pay out in rebates, they're never going to pay out enough, based on the numbers I was just describing, that will bring them down to the lowest net cost drug. So I'm going to give you an example of some high-cost, very questionable drugs that have been on major PBMs formularies in the past few years. And you have to ask yourself, why are these drugs on these formularies? Why aren't they excluding them? And the answer very well could be because the PBMs are getting rebates, then promising the high rebates to the plans, and winning RFPs and being retained by the plans because they're paying out more and more and more in rebates. But you don't want to favor a high-cost drug and get rebates on it unless you're absolutely certain that those rebates are going to bring you down to the lowest net cost. And since they won't tell you what the drug-by-drug rebates are, you can't get absolutely certain that that's what's taking place. So if you see a lot of high-cost drugs on a formulary, you should be scratching your head and saying, I have a feeling this PBM is favoring high-cost drugs. and trying to lure me in by promising me large rebates, and that's not in my interests. So here's some examples. Vimovo and Duexis are two what they're called combo products. All they are is a proton pump inhibitor on the outside, like Nexium or Prilosec, and then some sort of aspirin product or NSAID on the inside. And the reason they came up with these combo products is some people, when they take aspirin, get stomach aches. Not all people, but some people. And when they take the aspirin product, they get a stomach ache, they don't want to take it. And so if you coat the outside of the aspirin product, or NSAID, with a proton pump inhibitor that will coat your stomach first, then you're less likely to get a stomach ache. So you put the pill in your stomach, the outside part dissolves, coats your stomach, gives you some protection, and then when your body dissolves into the aspirin part of the drug, you're less likely to get a stomach ache. It's a very clever product. Except it's not clever enough to merit a $2,000 per 30-day script cost, because you can just take the two drugs separately. If it cost $20 or $30, maybe you'd say, great product, brilliant invention, but $2,000 per 30 days? If you know how many people you have who are taking aspirin and who might instead take Duexis or Vimovo, you're going to run yourself up a very big bill if you let Vimovo and Duexis onto your formularies. So you have to ask yourself, if a PBM is managing my health care appropriately and paying attention to which drugs should be excluded logically and which should be included, no PBM should have Vimovo and Duexis on their formulary, but they do. And why is that? Presumably because they're getting rebates, and then they're offering to give you the rebates, saying to you, oh, I'm going to save you a lot of money, I'm going to give you a lot of rebates. But collecting rebates on Vimovo and Duexis, their rebates would have to bring the $2,000 drug down to about $30. I doubt they're collecting that kind of money, and I really doubt that when they collect it, it's all rebates. They may be collecting a lot. They may be collecting $500 or $800. But how much of that is rebates and how much of that is other payments that they're keeping for themselves? So running through this list very quickly, Solodin and Absorbica are acne treatments. So do you want your plan spending $1,050 or $1,700, $780 on average for an acne treatment that doesn't have evidence that it's any better than over-the-counter acne treatments? What's steering the PBMs to include those drugs on their formularies? Presumably rebates and other payments. Restasis and Zedra are dry eye treatments. You probably see them advertised on TV non-stop. And you probably have a lot of members using them. Most people who have dry eye problems can get the same results by going into the pharmacy and going to the over-the-counter section and buying a dry eye treatment that will cost them about $4. So why a PBM would have Restasis or Zedra on their formularies, or at least not put them on with very heavy prior authorizations, it's very questionable conduct on the part of the PBMs. Lidocaine is a pain-relieving, soothing gel. It's over-the-counter. The prescription version of it costs $240+ per script. The over-the-counter that you could pick up for a few bucks. And finally, Glumetza is a really interesting drug. It's cost about $8,000 per 30 days. It's a diabetes treatment. That means one person taking Glumetza for a year will spend about $100,000. Anybody who knows anything about diabetes, or anybody who watches any TV, knows there's lots and lots and lots of diabetes treatments. You do not have to take $8,000 Glumetza. It shouldn't be on any PBM's formulary. The only reason it could possibly be on the formulary is to collect rebates and other payments. So is there any way to change this situation? Here's how you change the situation. First, you need to make sure that your contract contains a pass-through of 100% of all manufacturer and other third-party payments, not just rebates. So 100% of all payments. The contract has to state that. Whatever the label, it has to be passed through. You need to have the right to obtain net cost information on any drug, factoring in the amounts of money being passed through to you. So you need to know what the rebates are on any drug. If you're confronted with a Hep C formulary and you're trying to evaluate it, you need to be able to ask, What are the rebates you're getting on Epclusa Express Scripts? Tell me what they are. And then I'll decide whether or not I want you to favor Epclusa instead of Mavirate. You need the right, therefore, to customize your formulary, because once you ask the question, if you get answers that show you that the wrong decisions were made, you have to be able to customize the formulary. And then you need the right to customize programs, meaning prior authorization, step therapy, and quantity limit programs. So the next obvious question is, can you actually get this from any PBM? And the answer is yes, you can. So we run RFPs. We've been running them since 2005. We've been getting this information. We've been getting PBMs to agree to this information since 2005. Every PBM will not, but some will. One of the reasons Alliance Coal has saved the money that they've saved is because they have a contract with Envision, and Envision has agreed to give them this information. And they get that information regularly. We siphon through all of the information that comes through, and then we customize the formulary and we customize programs based on knowing what the net costs of all drugs are. And now that this new information has become available from Mavirate and Zapatir, those two low-cost Hep C drugs, we will be asking Envision for net cost information, and we will customize the Hep C category for Alliance Coal. So they will know that they have all three genotypes covered. If we can, and it makes sense, we'll cover Mavirate because it's ribavirin-free and it's an 8-week treatment. And Alliance Coal will end up with, for sure, the lowest net cost Hep C treatments. And we will exclude the high cost Hep C treatments that don't make sense to include on the formulary. So a final little discussion about rebates, which is there are many, many people predicting, as you saw from the headlines, that rebates are about to disappear. So knowing what you now know, the first thing that everybody should be asking themselves is, do you mean rebates are going to disappear, or do you mean rebates and all those other payments are going to disappear? What's going to disappear exactly? Only rebates, or all third-party payments that are going on in these secret deals? And you saw the headlines from the government. Both Scott Gottlieb at the FDA and Azar at CMS, Secretary Azar, they both talked about rebates. They didn't talk about all third-party money. They may have just been using the name, the nomenclature that people think about, or they may actually only be thinking about eliminating rebates. So that's the first question to ask. If they only eliminate rebates, then obviously they will not accomplish very much. In fact, the consequences of doing that, I think, are quite severe. Because what will happen is PBMs will obviously continue to make the secret deals they're making. They will still have an incentive to favor the wrong drugs because they will still be making money from all those other payments. Manufacturers will be better off, assuming the PBMs don't glom onto 100% of what they were paying before and they take some subset of it. Manufacturers will be better off because they won't have to pay the rebates anymore. Their list prices will remain the same, but they won't be paying the rebates anymore. So unless the PBMs extract 100% of what they were extracting before and label it all other payments, the manufacturers will end up better off, which is probably why all the manufacturers are now clamoring to get rid of rebates. Plans costs will be higher. Note that plans costs will be higher if they get rid of rebates or if they get rid of all third-party money, because right now plans are paying for the cost of drugs and getting the benefit of rebates. But if they pay for the cost of drugs and all rebates are taken away, then they don't have any discount off the cost of drugs. So plans will be worse off initially when rebates get eliminated. And they will continue to be worse off if manufacturers keep raising their prices and there's nothing available to bring those prices down. So the notion that if we eliminate rebates, we're going to cure everything is not accurate. We have to eliminate rebates, eliminate all other payments, and then create some competitive system to bring prices down. And unless we create that competitive system, which it is possible to create, but nobody is talking about it, unless we create that system, we're going to be much worse off. All formularies, therefore, will need to be changed and changed very quickly, which means given that there's a debate about rebates being removed, means that everybody right now should be scrambling to put themselves in a position where they can customize their own formulary. You will especially not want to be in a position where you can't customize if rebates are removed, because you'll have higher costs and you'll have no ability to lower them. And that will, of course, also mean that the pricing terms in contracts will be very important, because if you lose the ability to discount through a rebate, to get back some of the money through a rebate, you will really have to control your costs. So I just want to mention to you that all of those things, all of those controls we just talked about with rebates are obtainable. I want to reiterate, they are obtainable. You can get them. Alliance Coal has them. We have lots of other clients who have them. The coalition that we set up, that Alliance Coal is a member, has a contract where all of this is already done. So any coalition member that joins the coalition gets the benefit of all of this. It's all set up for you. Or alternatively, if you're large enough, you could conduct an RFP, conduct the RFP in such a way that you bid it out a contract that requires all of this, and then make sure that the PBM you select is willing to give it all to you. These are critical terms if you want to control your costs. So other problems in PBM contracts. I want to go through just a few of them to give you an illustration of just how bad the system is. This is, I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg on how bad the system is. And to illustrate how bad the system is, the contract that we've written to try to control as many of the problems as we know exist, it's 200 pages long. That's not because I'm a lawyer who likes to write long contracts. It's because there's so many things you need to control. You need to have provision after provision after provision preventing the norm from occurring. So I'm going to give you a few highlights of that. So virtually all contracts contain retail and mail price guarantees. If you have a PBM contract, it has some sort of price guarantee in it for retail drugs and mail drugs, and it's probably broken down into brand drug and generic drug guarantees. So your contract will say for retail brand drugs, on average across the year, we guarantee a discount of AWP minus 16%, or AWP minus 15, or AWP minus 21, whatever the numbers are. But it's a retail brand drug guarantee. And then you'll have a retail generic drug guarantee, and then you'll have a mail brand drug and a mail generic drug guarantee. Both the definitions for the terms brand drug and generic drug are written in such a way that they're basically useless. So people think brand drugs are brand drugs, generic drugs are generic drugs, everybody knows what they are. That's just not true in the PBM world. So the definitions, I'm going to give you a few examples here. There are thousands of contracts in the country that define a brand drug as a brand drug is based on our PBM's proprietary algorithm. What's their proprietary algorithm? Well, it's proprietary, so you're not entitled to know. The generic drugs are then defined as all drugs that aren't brand. So they use a proprietary algorithm to define brand drugs, and then generics are all the fallout from their proprietary algorithm. They say in their contract, we, the PBM, have the right to define and classify brand drugs as brands and generic drugs as generics. Well, that's no different from a proprietary algorithm. Or they say, brand drugs are the drugs that are classified under First Data Bank as brand drugs. Well, First Data Bank doesn't classify drugs as brand drugs. So it's a terrific cross-reference, except it's meaningless. First Data Bank is a national reporting system. It doesn't classify drugs as brands or generics. It classifies them in all kinds of ways, but not as brands or generics. So it's a very misleading definition. There are thousands of contracts that say that. If you go back to your offices and pull out your contract, at the beginning of the contract or towards the end, there will be a definition section. Look up the definition for brand drug. Look up the definition for generic drug. It's virtually certain you'll have something, some gibberish like that. So why does it matter that the definitions are meaningless? It means that the guarantees are worthless, and I'll give you an example of why. So if you went into a grocery store and you saw in the window of the grocery store a sign that said all fish guaranteed at $7.95 or less per pound, and then you saw that fish had an asterisk next to it, and the asterisk stated the grocery has the right to decide which fish are included in the guarantee, how much would that fish guarantee be worth? Not much, right? Now, if you went and you saw two grocery stores right next to each other, and one grocery store had a guarantee like that said $7.95 per pound, and the next grocery store had a guarantee that said $5.95 per pound, which grocery could you depend upon to give you lower cost fish? You would have no idea, right? Because each of them has fish asterisks, and they get to decide which fish go in the guarantee, meaning the guarantees are worthless. They don't promise you anything. You can't depend upon them. That's particularly true if the grocery store has the right to change which fish go in and out of the guarantee whenever it wants. So if you define, if the PBM contract says all retail brand drugs on average will have a discount of AWP minus 16%, but your brand drug definition is, it's whatever we call it under our proprietary algorithm, how good is that guarantee? And then if you're conducting an RFP and you have one PBM that offers you AWP minus 16% with an amorphous brand drug definition, and another PBM that offers you AWP minus 21% and also has an amorphous brand drug definition, can you compare the two? And should you be picking the one that has the better discount of minus 21%? That's basically what's going on every time everybody's running RFPs, because in this country, if you look at 99.99% of all contracts, they all have amorphous brand drug and generic drug definitions. So when you run an RFP or you look at your contract or your consulting firm says, I just negotiated with the PBM, I raised your guarantee from minus 16 to minus 17, I'm going to save you a lot of money. The first thing you should do is say, how am I defining brand drugs and generic drugs? Do these guarantees have any value, or am I getting nothing but a fish guarantee? And I will put money on it. I hate to tell you this, but I will put money on it, a lot of money, that every one of you is sitting on a contract that is basically nothing but fish guarantees, with the exception of Paul Mackey, who has a contract that does not have fish guarantees in it. He has pinned down definitions for brand drug and generic drug, so the contract actually has some value. And he knows when the contract guarantee says AWP minus whatever the various numbers are, that's what he's actually going to get. So the implication of this, obviously, is that all pricing terms and guarantees related to retail and mail drugs basically have no meaning, and you basically have no control over your retail or mail costs. Can you obtain control? It's actually quite easy. You just have to write your own brand drug and generic drug definition. You need to use what are called MONY codes out of Metaspan. It pins down what's a brand and what's a generic. And once you do that, you're home free. So when you look at your contract, see if that's what you have. If you don't have that, and it doesn't square pretty clearly with what I've just given you in this take-home package, then you probably do not have pinned down definitions, and you probably have no control over your retail and mail drug costs. So specialty drugs suffer from the exact same problem. So specialty drugs are very high cost drugs. They represent about less than 5% of your total scripts. They represent 25% or more of your total costs. And they're getting to be a larger and larger percent of your total costs. So the predictions are that they will be about 50% of your total costs in a few years. So if you don't control the cost of specialty drugs, you've got a real problem on your hands. So obviously, in order to control the cost of your specialty drugs, you now know enough to know you don't want a fish guarantee. Fish asterisk, specialty drug asterisk will define specialty drugs any way we want. Because if you have a guarantee that's based on some undefined group of drugs, the PBM can take the drugs in and out of the category, and you don't know what's being covered. So I'll give you an example of what's probably in your contract. It probably reads something like this. Specialty drugs may be any high-cost drug that may require special handling, or may. I italicized the words may. They're not italicized in your contract. But your contract will have some sort of definition that just says it's some loosey-goosey group of drugs that are high cost, or that require special handling, or that may require temperature control. That doesn't pin down what's a specialty drug. So you're right back in that category. Fish asterisk, $7.95 per pound. Specialty drugs, essentially asterisk, AWP minus 16% on average. Well, which drugs are going to go in that guarantee? Nobody knows, including you. And can the PBM take certain drugs out that they're charging much more for? Absolutely, because the contract's written that way. And when you hire an auditor to see whether the contract was honored, the auditor will just accept whatever drugs the PBM lists that they included in the guarantee, because that's the way you wrote your contract. And when they come back and say the PBM lived up to the guarantee, it doesn't really give you any information, any more than you would have information if you went into the grocery store and only one fish was covered, tilapia, at $3.95 for the $7.95 guarantee. And then you came back and said, grocery store, you honored this guarantee. You charged me less than $7.95 for tilapia. Does that give you any information about what you were paying for fish, for all the other fish you bought? No. Does it tell you whether you went to the right grocery store to purchase your fish? No. Does it tell you whether the grocery store overcharged you for all of the other fish? No. That's what your auditors are doing when they're auditing these useless guarantees. They're just telling you, you have a contract that was written so poorly, we audited it, all we can tell you is that they honored those very poor guarantees. Unfortunately, most auditors don't also say, you should really rewrite this contract. They don't want to tell you that, because then they're going to essentially get themselves out of the auditing business. They won't have any clients, because the only thing to audit are these very poorly written contracts. So bottom line is, all specialty drug guarantees are also basically useless. So if you put 2 and 2 together, what I've just told you is your retail guarantees don't have any value, your mail guarantees don't have any value, your specialty drug guarantees don't have any value, and you're in a terrible position with respect to rebates, because your PBMs are probably favoring higher cost drugs in order to make sure they can put more money in their own pockets with those other payments, and then passing through to you some amount of rebates. You don't know what the rebates are, and you don't know the extent to which they're actually reducing the costs of any of your high-cost drugs. So basically, all 4 components of your contract are in a shambles: retail, mail, specialty, and rebates. And it's all a function of the fact that the contract is written so badly. So I just want to give you another specialty drug problem that illustrates just how bad these guarantees can be. If you have specialty drug, even properly defined, which it's very unlikely you do, and then you have an average guarantee of AWP minus 16% for all specialty drugs that are listed, does that actually control your costs? It doesn't, because suppose you have one drug that costs $3,000 per script, another that costs $25,000 per script, and another that costs $50,000 per script. And you have an average guarantee of minus 16%. Well, the PBM can very steeply discount the $3,000 drug and give you almost no discount on the $50,000 drug. And you'll end up in a very poor position. They'll still meet that guarantee, right? But an average discount across drugs that have very disparate prices like that doesn't make any sense rationally, mathematically. And that's if you pin down which drugs are covered by the guarantee. So how can you control your specialty drug costs? You can. You need a contract that does the following. Your contract first has to define what's a specialty drug. The way to do that is create a list of all specialty drugs, there's about 1,000 of them, and cross-reference the definition to that list, and then say, we also have the right to add specialty drugs as they enter the market. Now I've pinned down what's a specialty drug. I've covered every single drug, I've cross-referenced it to it with a definition, and I'm going to have the right to add new to markets. So I've pinned it down, so I no longer have fish asterisks. Now I know all my fish are covered. Second, you need a drug-by-drug guarantee for all those drugs. You don't want an average. So you've already got your list of 1,000 drugs. You want a drug-by-drug guarantee for them. You particularly want that because some drugs, believe it or not, specialty drugs have 30, 40, 60, 80% discounts available. Many do not. You can only get a 15 or 16 or 17% discount. But you definitely want to take each drug and get the best discount you can on every one of them. Then you need a default discount guarantee for all the new to markets that you're going to add, because you know that there's going to be 20 to 40 new to markets every year. Then you need a quarterly right to renegotiate the discounts. You don't want to be stuck with the same discounts for 3 years. And you want to be able to put new discounts on the new to markets. And then finally, you should have a carve-out right, because if you go to your PBM and you say, look, I'm pretty sure I can get a better discount for Enbrel. You were giving me 16%, but I know the marketplace now is offering 18%, and the PBM says to you, I just can't do that. Then you want to be able to carve the drug out and go to another specialty drug pharmacy and get it for the 18%, because Enbrel costs $5,000 a script, and you have a lot of people taking Enbrel, and that difference of 2% could add up to a lot of money. So if you get all of that, then you can control your specialty drug costs. Can you get all of that? You can. Our clients all have it. Paul Mackey has it. It's feasible to get it. And then once you get it, you have to actually exercise it. So there's at least one PBM in the country that will give it to you. Paul Mackey has Envision, and Envision is providing it. There are other PBMs that will give it to you too. All of them will not. So you may need to leave the PBM you're using because many of them will not give you these terms. So you have a choice of, do I take a PBM that may be a larger PBM that may be better known, that's going to essentially give me a contract that controls nothing, not retail, not mail, not specialty, and not rebates? Or do I go with a smaller PBM, which is perfectly capable, I assure you, of handling all of your business and controlling your costs? So what can your plan do? I've pretty much already laid it out, but I'm just going to summarize it. You want to get a PBM contract that pins down brand drug and generic drug definitions, that pins down specialty drug definitions, that gives you minimum discount guarantees on all specialty drugs, meaning about 1,000 drugs, that gives you a default discount guarantee for new to market drugs, that's about 20 to 40 drugs every year, that gives you a right to renegotiate all your guarantees so you're not stuck with a stale contract, that gives you a carve-out right over specialty drugs, that because you want that carve-out right, you have to eliminate the exclusivity provision that's in all of your contracts because you want to be able to go to other entities if you need to. That gives you full disclosure of all manufacturer and all pharmacy contracts so you can audit all of this. And that gives you a right to terminate within 90 days. Not that you're necessarily going to exercise it, but that gives you the leverage to get out if you find out you're not getting what you bargained for. And then finally, of course, don't forget about your rebates. You need to make sure your contract passes through 100% of all payments, not just rebates. You want to make sure you have a right to obtain net cost information, drug by drug information, so that when you get presented with what their choices are on Hep C drugs and on every other therapeutic category, you can evaluate it for yourself. And then you want to make sure that your contract has meaningful rebate guarantees. So you want to guarantee at some level what you're going to get for rebates. I didn't cover that in great detail, but you do need rebate guarantees. Once you get all of those terms, you've got to exercise them. So you can't put them in your contract and then forget about them. So by exercising them, you need to actually get the net cost information. You need to customize your formulary and programs. You need to exercise your rights to renegotiate specialty drug guarantees. When the pricing becomes available, you need to exercise your carve-out right if you need to, and you need to respond to the marketplace. So if there's high-cost drugs that are that have come out, and a new generic enters the market because the high-cost brand has lost its patent, you need to block the high-cost brand and only allow your members to get to the generic. There's a lot of marketplace shifting events, and you need to respond to them. So one final thing that you need to do, almost all of you probably have consulting firms in place. If you have a consulting firm in place, you really need to get the consulting firm to execute a conflict of interest disclosure form. And the reason I say that is because many, if not most, consulting firms are being paid by PBMs to feed them business. That's also true of audit firms. Many audit firms are also consulting firms, so you need to make sure your audit firms execute conflict of interest disclosure forms. And the conflict forms should contain two parts. One should be a disclosure of any monies they may be receiving from any PBM. And the second part should be what's known in the law as a liquidated damages provision, because that's what puts teeth in the form. If the form only says, please disclose any financial interests, any financial monies you may be getting from the PBMs or other third parties, it will not necessarily be accurate if there's no teeth in it. There will be accuracy to it if you say, if you fail to disclose money you're getting and we find out, or if you misrepresent the amounts you're getting and we find out, here's what you'll have to pay us, then the consulting firm will have to take very seriously filling out that form. And then you're much more likely to get honest representations. So if you want a conflict of interest disclosure form to use, they're on our website. You can download them for free. You don't have to sign up. You don't have to give me your name. Just go onto the website and download the form, and then you can tinker with it, or your lawyers can tinker with it however they want. But it's all set up. I would urge you all, to the extent you're making any evaluation of anything using a consulting firm, to require every consulting firm and every audit firm to fill out a conflict form and make sure it contains a liquidated damages provision. And I say that very strongly, and I say that it should be all. If you were to come to me, you should make me fill it out. If you go to anybody else, you should make them fill it out. The conflicts are rampant in this industry. There are billions of dollars at stake, and consulting firms are being offered very large amounts of money. I know that because I've been offered those very large amounts of money. And if they're offering me that money and they know that I take the positions I take, you can imagine what's going on in the industry. So for sure, if you're making any decisions, get a conflict of interest disclosure form executed. Bottom line is you can decrease your costs, and I'd really urge you to do so. You can do it by conducting an RFP. You can do it by joining a coalition. You have to make sure the coalition is set up to actually help you. Obviously, we think ours is. And I would urge you to take action, because when you do take action, you will not only decrease your costs, you will ensure that your members get access to wiser drug use, and you'll also, in your own way, change the whole marketplace. Because the reason the marketplace is as bad as it is because essentially no one is taking action to change it. So the way the marketplace will change is if every person in this room does something. That's when the marketplace will change.
This has been fascinating, Paul, for me.